I wasn't always a big poetry person. I didn't really get poetry. So often I would just read a poem and think, okay, that works. But it never really hit me. Until, that is, I found the perfect poem for me. Welcome aboard the International Express to Book Central. Grab a seat, settle in, and let's while away the journey with some poetry chat. I'm your host Jules, and today we're talking about a poem. As a little hint for all of you, I recorded this episode quite a while ago, so maybe the audio quality here and there is a little bit lacking, as I have gotten a little better at editing since then, but I hope you nonetheless enjoy my analysis of my favorite ever poem. And I'll be back next week with an episode about a book. This poem has been with me for almost a decade now, and I often read it, write it out, or even whisper it to myself sometimes. It is one of those poems. The poem I mean is Often Rebuked, Yet Always Back Returning by Emily Brontë, who lived from 1818 until 1848. Emily lived a short but fiery life. While her older sister Charlotte, the author of Jane Eyre, is perhaps the one with the greatest acclaim, Emily is the one with a very passionate group of fans. Poor Anne, the third sister, will absolutely get her turn next, if I have anything to do with it. Some things about Emily are well known, chief being that she loved being outdoors, and that she wasn't a very sociable person. She didn't do well at boarding school, nor as a teacher, but she did have a great mind. She was incredibly stubborn, which probably didn't make her the easiest person to get along with. For me, this poem has been a way of understanding her more. While Often Rebuked is inspirational in its independence, I also think it is important to see the struggle in it, the desire to find a path forward, to find balance. I think this informs Emily's character as much as her desire for freedom. Often Rebuked consists of 5 stanzas, made up of quatrains, or 4 lines, which follow the ABAB, CD rhyme scheme. One of the things I've always enjoyed about Emily's poetry is that she doesn't really care for meter. She does alternate the number of syllables in her lines, which gives a nice flow to the poem without creating a rigid structure for it. This particular fits Often Rebuked very well, as it does argue against too tight a constraint or too narrow a path. With that general information out of the way, let's have a look at the poem. I'll read it out first, and then we'll go through it stanza by stanza. My way of reading it has very much been inspired by the beautiful rendition of it by Frankie McEachin, which I'll make sure to link in the description. Often rebuked, yet always back returning to those first feelings that were born with me, and leaving busy chase of wealth and learning for idle dreams of things which cannot be. Today, I will seek not the shadowy region, its unsustaining vastness waxes drear, and visions rising, legion after legion, bring the unreal world too strangely near. I'll walk, but not in old heroic traces, and not in paths of high morality, and not among the half-distinguished faces, the clouded forms of long past history. I'll walk where my own nature would be leading. It vexes me to choose another guide, where the grey flocks in ferny glens are feeding, where the wild wind blows on the mountainside. What have those lonely mountains worth revealing? More glory and more grief than I can tell. The earth that wakes one human heart to feeling can centre both the worlds of heaven and hell. I hope you got something of the vibe of this poem from that. Now let's get into the nitty-gritty details of the stanzas themselves. A first thing to note in the first stanza is that Emily is writing from the first person here, but that the presence of the I is not intrusive to the reader. The experiences and feelings she is describing are to some extent natural to any young person growing up in a tightly constrained society or family. Even if the restraints aren't tightly wound, There is nonetheless something very recognizable about the young person wanting to follow their own wild imagination rather than the path of wealth and learning that might be set out for them. This idea is very much the heart of the poem. The first 2 lines give us an indication that our narrator has frequently been rebuked or scolded for following her own inclinations, those first feelings that are natural to her, rather than the lessons she has been taught. While she is aware of the sensibilities of her society and the ways she should behave, our narrator consistently goes back to those things that were born with me. It speaks to a natural sensibility and knowledge of oneself, listening to an interior voice rather than the outside voice. For someone as single-minded and apparently stubborn as Amelie, this is hardly a surprise. However, it also echoes to a more primitive sensibility, to a return to nature and the earth, away from the hustle and bustle of society. The narrator tells us that rather than chase wealth and learning, she would rather enjoy idle dreams of things which cannot be. The poem sets up this confrontation between the everyday, the expected, and the personal and imagined. While our narrator is fully aware that her daydreams are not realistic, she nonetheless prefers these over the busy chase of normal society. Considering how busy life has become in the 21st century, this sentiment only rings more true for those who do enjoy sinking away into their own imagination. The colon at the end of the 4th line is also important. It suggests a setup to something, that something relevant is coming next. In my opinion, the 2nd stanza is the most complex one of the poem, and yet also almost functions like its mission statement. The 1st line could almost work like one of those manifestation statements. Our narrator determines that today something will change, that the shadowy region will not be visited. What exactly the shadowy region is not yet made clear. I've seen many interpretations that argue this region is society itself. I think it might be a little bit more complex, or perhaps a combination of different things. What we do know is that it is an unsustaining vastness which waxes drear. The word unsustaining is key. This region, these shadows, are so large that they cannot sustain or support themselves. Sustaining here also echoes sustenance, for me, the idea of nourishment and food, but for the mind rather than the body. This shadowy region is a dreary place, then, which cannot sustain or comfort a human being, and yet our poet is clearly consistently drawn there, or she wouldn't have to state that today she will not seek it out. Seek it out, furthermore, implies an active choice. This shadowy region is not somewhere she is forced to be. The 1st stanza spoke of idle dreams, but now the poet is confronted with visions rising, legion after legion. Are these the same dreams, now appearing before her as a vision? Is it the same imagination, which seemed so natural and comforting in the 1st stanza, which here shows its dark side? The use of legion implies something dominating, military, or at least confrontational. These visions bring forth the unreal world and bring it too strangely near. Is the poet warning us that while sinking into idle dreams and first feelings can be comforting, it is also dangerous? She seems to suggest that by idling in her own imagination too much, ideas and visions come up which create a world around her she does not recognize, which does not exist. Yet they come in such number that this unreal world comes too close to the poet. The use of strangely is fascinating to me because it seems to imply a certain distance or oddness. For me, it brings to mind the way that dreams, once again, seem utterly real when you're in them until you notice the one little unreal thing. And then the dream is strangely near and yet utterly other as well. I think this is the balance Brontë is trying to strike here in the first 2 stanzas. She sets up herself as someone who has always returned to her own ideas and feelings, despite being told not to. She finds a comfort there, seemingly, which polite society and learning could not, yet the 2nd stanza flips this into a darker, shadowy region. Her dreams of things which cannot be lead to the unreal world, in which she may risk losing herself. She cannot sustain herself with this imaginary world, and so she needs to look for something more concrete, more real. Yet this shadowy region, this unnatural world, is still also the world of society, of chasing wealth and learning. Both of these, the life of society and the life purely of the mind, are rejected here. So where else can she go? This is where the rest of the poem comes in. The first two words of the first line of the third stanza are crucial, I think. This metaphor of moving forward, impressed by the "I'll walk," suggests that our poet is on their way towards something, that exploring and finding something new is key. She chooses to leave aside old heroic traces and paths of high morality. This gives us an insight perhaps into those visions and idle dreams of the first two stanzas. Raised on literature and scripture, it is no surprise that Emily Bronte's mind would be filled with heroes and morality. It is no wonder that her imagination would bring her to an unreal world in which heroes of old existed. While these stories may have laid out a path for her, she here actively rejects them. She also rejects the half-distinguished faces, the clouded forms of long-past history. It follows the same idea as the first two lines, summing up the influences that the poet now rejects. The use of half-distinguished always got me. On the one hand, it plays into distinguished, as in, I just about managed to see, suggesting that these people from the past are indeed too far away to really make out. On the other hand, there is distinguished, meaning someone successful or authoritative. With them being half distinguished, I feel Emily might be poking a little bit of fun at the stern faces constantly rebuking her. The repetition of "I'll walk" ties these third and fourth stanzas together. While the first two stanzas set up the pros and cons of her imagination, the third and fourth discuss what the poet does and does not want to do in the future. She wants to go where my own nature would be leading. This differs, in my opinion, from the first feelings, from the first stanza in the development it suggests. And nature takes some time to grow into, to get to know. She is referring to her internal guide who will be leading her, rather than the heroic, moral, half-distinguished forms from the third stanza. These two lines not only express a strong sense of independence, but also a certain stubbornness, which comes through in the use of vex. You would usually use vex in reference to trivial things, but here Emily is speaking of the path she will choose for her life. Hardly trivial. I think the same humor comes through here as mentioned above. It is a wry humor, which suggests there could be no other guide for her anyway. I believe the two colons at the end of the first line and at the end of the second line are meant to enclose this second line, almost like parentheses. The next two lines of the fourth stanza tell us where, in reality, her footsteps will be taking the poet. The repeat of where tells us this now refers to an actual locality, and of course it is Emily's beloved moors and glens. These two lines are pretty straightforward in that they are clear descriptions. They are nonetheless stunning in how vivid they are. She does not describe this landscape as a luscious oasis. Rather, it is grey and wild, it is windy and populated by flocks of animals. This is not tamed or inspiring nature. This is nature in its purest form, uncaring for the human within it. The poet is speaking of the real world in contrast to the unreal world, a harsh, yet inspiring place, one which can make you feel alive in a way the shadowy region and its visions cannot. Anyone who has felt a cold wind whip across their face while they cross hills or mountains surely knows what she means. The previous few stanzas and lines have been very intellectual, in the sense that the poet is addressing society at large, learning, wealth, old heroic texts, morality, etc. These two lines drastically step away from that and reveal what Emily saw as the antidote for that unsustaining vastness. It is, quite simply, the reality and harsh comfort of the natural world. It is real to her in a way none of those forms of long-past history are. Nature makes our poet ask questions in the fifth and final stanza. While it's technically a rhetorical question, it nonetheless holds relevance here. The poem so far has been filled with rather dark and obscure imagery, yet it is this mountain, this landscape, this view, which the poet believes can truly tell her something of glory and grief. It is this natural world that can wake one human heart to feeling. This use of feeling here, of course, connects us back to the first stanza, to those first feelings born with me. While a poet has been born innately with a sense of feeling, it is only the earth, the natural environment, that can truly awaken these feelings in a human. It is this balance between glory and grief, between born feelings and awakened feelings, which allows the earth to be the place that can center both the worlds of heaven and hell. It is not just that we find ourselves in between these two extremes, it is rather, I believe, that our world contains both of these extremes. Our poet has moved between idle dreams she adores and shadowy regions, between unreal and real worlds, between the drudgery of society and the wild mountain air. It is about finding that center, a path between these two extremes in life. While this poem absolutely makes a case for following your own instincts, following where your nature leads, it also advocates for that to be a balanced journey. One should not fall too far into the unreal world of dreams and visions. One also shouldn't be following blindly in the footsteps of half-distinguished faces to chase wealth or learning. Find a way in between, one that speaks to you but keeps you away from that which becomes dreary or vexes you. And yes, the natural world, the harsh mountainside, the ferns and flocks of animals, they are as good a reminder of this as the earth can give you. So, those are my thoughts on this poem and its message. I hope it can be as inspiring and comforting for you as it is for me. Of course, poetry, almost more than literature maybe, is absolutely subjective. So if you have any thoughts, I would love to hear what you think. And that's it for today. If you have questions, thoughts on the book, or recommendations or requests for future episodes, feel free to leave a comment or send me an email at bookcentralpod@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. You can also subscribe to be informed when new episodes drop. You can find references to the materials used today in the description. Book Central is written and produced by me, and our music is by Scott Buckley. Thank you for joining me today on the International Express to Book Central.